What if I told you that after the Australian Grand Prix someone in the paddock began to suspect that George Russell's Mercedes was hiding something that shouldn't be there? Something that forced us to check cameras, radios, telemetry, and that ended up leaving Frédéric Vasseur completely shocked when he saw the data. Because what seemed like a simple investigation by the stewards ended up uncovering a series of figures and behavior of the car that did not completely fit with what the other teams were seeing on the track. Top speed that was too strong, an electrical display that seemed to last longer than normal, and a performance that began to raise many questions within the paddock. But the big question is this: was Mercedes really hiding something in Russell's car? Or is it all a brilliant interpretation of the regulations that no one else has discovered yet? The Australian Grand Prix weekend seemed to start like any other start to the season in Formula One. Melbourne offered the typical conditions of Albert Park, a demanding semi-urban circuit, high temperatures, and a track that forces teams to find the perfect balance between top speed and stability in fast corners. But behind that apparent normality, small details began to happen that, as the hours passed, would end up setting off alarms within the paddock. It all started during the weekend sessions when George Russell's Mercedes began to constantly move into competitive positions, showing very solid performance in sectors where other teams were suffering. It wasn't just a matter of rhythm. What caught the most attention was the way in which the car delivered its power and how it maintained speed in areas where energy or aerodynamic were normally forces you to lift your foot. Those first signs went unnoticed by many fans, but within the rival garages some engineers began to look more closely at the data that appeared on the shared telemetry screens. The situation took an unexpected turn when Russell became involved in two stewards' investigations over the weekend itself. The first arose from an incident in the pit lane with a Racing Bull's car, a confusing moment that forced the officials to review what happened carefully to determine if there was any responsibility on the part of the Mercedes driver. Shortly after, a second case appeared related to a start simulation that had not exactly followed the race director's instructions. At first glance, they seemed like minor incidents, relatively common situations on a busy weekend. However, these investigations forced the FIA to review a huge amount of material: onboard cameras, circuit recordings, radio communications, and most important of all, the complete telemetry data of the Mercedes W17. That process opened a door that normally remains closed to rivals, because when stewards analyze a car in such detail, technical data inevitably comes to light that can reveal much more than expected. While the stewards analyzed the incident to determine if there was any sanction, the data began to show something curious. Russell's Mercedes presented very particular figures at certain times of the lap, especially when the driver activated attack modes or defended position against other cars. Top speed was remarkably strong compared to several direct rivals, and, at the same time, the car seemed to maintain a very stable level of performance in fast corners where you normally pay the price of carrying little downforce. That combination began to raise questions within the paddock because achieving both things at the same time is not easy. If you prioritize speed on the straight, you usually lose performance in curves, and if you load the car to gain stability, you usually sacrifice top speed. However, Mercedes seemed to find a balance that other teams were not achieving. As engineers reviewed the records, another even more intriguing detail emerged. The deployment of the car's hybrid system seemed to last longer than expected in certain sections of the circuit. In Formula One, energy management is one of the most delicate aspects of performance because the available electrical energy is strictly limited by the regulations and by the capacity of the battery. Normally, drivers must carefully manage when to use that extra power, but in Russell's case there seemed to be a consistency in that deployment that didn't quite fit with the usual patterns shown by other cars on the track. This did not automatically mean that there was something illegal, but it was enough to arouse the curiosity of several teams who began to observe each lap of the Mercedes more closely during the Australian weekend. Finally, the stewards concluded that none of the incidents investigated deserved a serious sporting sanction. The contact in the pit lane was interpreted more as a communication problem than a deliberate dangerous maneuver, and the simulated start was partly explained by the difficulty of seeing the markings on the track due to the lighting conditions. But the true effect of these investigations was not the final decision, but the fact that the Mercedes W17 had come under much more intense technical scrutiny than usual. Additional analyses on power, aerodynamic efficiency, and energy performance began to circulate among engineers, analysts, and technical directors. And it was precisely at that moment that the first theories began to emerge within the paddock about whether Mercedes had found some particularly clever or perhaps too ingenious way to take advantage of the limits of the technical regulations. What no one imagined at that time was that those small details observed during the weekend in Melbourne would end up causing a chain reaction within the rival teams. Because when the data began to be compared in greater depth, Some teams began to suspect that the performance of Russell's car could be hiding something more than just a good setup. And it was then that the name of Ferrari and Frédéric Vasseur began to appear in the middle of this story, because someone within Maranello decided to look at that data with special attention. The focus of these suspicions was especially concentrated on two areas of the car: the power unit and the energy management of the hybrid system. In modern Formula One, the balance between the combustion engine and the electrical system is one of the most determining factors of performance. Each team has a limited amount of electrical energy that they can deploy throughout the lap, forcing the drivers to use it strategically. However, when analysts reviewed the Mercedes data in Melbourne, they noticed something that seemed to break that usual pattern. At certain moments on the circuit, Russell's car maintained an apparently longer electric thrust than that of its rivals, especially when the driver activated attack modes or defended his position on the straight. This ability to sustain power for longer immediately sparked the first technical theories within the paddock. Some specialists began to speculate that Mercedes had developed an extremely efficient way to manage the energy of the hybrid system. Others went even further and hypothesized that the German team could be exploiting some aspect of the regulations related to the engine's compression ratio. According to these theories, the design of the engine could take advantage of the temperature differences between technical tests and real racing conditions to slightly modify the internal behavior of the engine when it reaches its operating temperature. In simple terms, the engine could perfectly comply with regulatory checks when cold, but behave differently once all its components reach the extreme temperatures of a Formula One race. These types of interpretations of the regulations would not necessarily be illegal if they remain within the permitted limits, but they could provide a technical advantage that is difficult to detect with the naked eye. Conversations about these potential advantages began to intensify in the paddock as other teams reviewed the available data. And it was at that moment when the name of Ferrari began to appear more strongly in this story. The Italian team, led by Frédéric Vasseur, has always been one of the most attentive to any technical detail that could alter the competitive balance of the championship. According to various interpretations within the paddock, some Ferrari engineers would have begun to analyze with particular interest the performance records of the Mercedes during the Australian Grand Prix. This was neither a direct accusation nor a formal protest, but rather a thorough review of the data to try to understand whether there really was a technical advantage hidden in the design or management of the car. These types of situations are not new in the history of Formula One. Over the decades, numerous teams have found creative interpretations of the regulations that have subsequently forced the FIA to revise or clarify certain technical rules. However, what made the Mercedes case in Australia especially intriguing was that the supposed advantage was not related to a visible part of the car, such as a spoiler or diffuser, but to something much more difficult to detect: the internal behavior of the power system and the way in which energy was deployed during the lap. That means that even with detailed inspections it could be difficult to prove whether there really was some kind of hidden technical advantage or whether it was all just an exceptional setup by Mercedes engineers. And that is precisely where this story becomes even more intriguing. Because in modern Formula One, many of the biggest technical advantages come not from breaking the regulations, but from understanding them better than everyone else. If Mercedes really has found a way to optimize its powertrain or energy management in a way that other teams don't yet fully understand, it could simply be a brilliant engineering solution. But if the rivals manage to decipher exactly what is happening inside the W17, it is very possible that in the next races we will see technical reactions, new interpretations of the regulations, and even possible clarifications from the FIA. What started as a routine investigation after a couple of incidents at the Australian Grand Prix ended up becoming one of the most talked about technical topics in the paddock. And although there is still no definitive answer about what is really happening inside George Russell's car, the truth is that now all the teams are observing every detail with much more attention. Because if there is something that the history of Formula One has shown time and time again, it is that behind every small technical mystery the next great advantage of the championship can be hidden. In the end, what happened after the Australian Grand Prix made something very clear within the paddock. When a car begins to show performance that does not quite fit the usual patterns, all the teams begin to look more closely. George Russell's Mercedes was not declared illegal, nor did the FIA find evidence that a hidden system exists within the W17. But the simple fact that the car data has raised so many questions shows how fine the technical margin is in modern Formula One. Sometimes a small difference in engine efficiency, in the management of the hybrid system, or in the way energy is deployed can create an advantage that from the outside seems almost impossible to explain. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.